Episode 7 of Becoming Elizabeth, To Laugh, to Lie, to Flatter, to Face, was yet another action-packed episode. We had an awful burning, John Dudley as a very different Lord Protector to Somerset, Somerset being released, Gardiner being attacked and arrested, Spain hatching a plot to help Mary escape, the King organising a match for Elizabeth, the King finally being allowed money and fun, Lady Jane Grey calling Elizabeth a whore, Robert Dudley professing his love for Elizabeth, and the King becoming ill. Phew, lots of storylines. But is any of this true? Join me, historian and author Claire Ridgway, as I look at the real history behind becoming Elizabeth. I got rather excited at the start of this episode when there was mention of getting the Archbishop to talk to the preacher who was going to be burnt. But then my hopes were sadly dashed when Edward VI chose justice over mercy and decided not to bother getting the Archbishop. Cranmer is still missing. Grrr. But what about the burning? Was the preacher really burnt in the yard at Whitehall in Edward VI's reign? Well, no, not that I can find. The famous burning of Edward VI's reign was that of Anabaptist Joan Botcher, or Butcher, who was burnt for heresy at Smithfield on the 2nd of May 1550. I'll give you a link to my video on Joan, but in brief, she'd been in trouble several times for her religious views and was convicted of heresy in April 1549 for her radical belief that Christ's flesh was not incarnate of the Virgin Mary, i.e. that Christ did not derive his humanity, his earthly body, from his mother, but that it was celestial or heavenly flesh. When Joan was condemned to death, she said, "It is a goodly matter to consider your ignorance. It was not long ago since you burnt Anne Askew for a piece of bread, and yet came yourself soon after to believe and profess the same doctrine for which you burnt her. And now, forsooth, you will needs burn me for a piece of flesh, and in the end you will come to believe this also, when you have read the Scriptures and understand them." Fair point. Even though she was condemned to death, she was left in prison for a while. Lord Protector Somerset had not been keen on heresy burnings, and attempts were made while she was kept at the home of Richard Rich, Lord Chancellor, to persuade her out of her more radical beliefs. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, both tried to do this, but Joan sadly wouldn't budge. Now, in this episode, we saw Edward being rather cold about the burning, but in reality, Edward had to be persuaded to sign Joan's death warrant by Archbishop Cranmer, who told the young king that he would take responsibility for it before God. Edward signed the warrant and Joan went to her death. The other famous burning of Edward VI's reign was that of Dutch Aryan George van Paris, who was burnt at the stake at Smithfield on the 25th of April 1551. He was accused of denying the divinity of Christ and was examined by Cranmer, Ridley and Miles Coverdale, who acted as an interpreter for the man as he had little English. Despite attempts to secure a pardon for him, he went to the flames. Those are the only two burnings I can think of in Edward's reign, and neither happened at Whitehall, and neither were wanted by the king. I can only assume that the burning in the series was used to show the regime change as John Dudley took the reins, and to show just how cold and brutal the young king could be. The next storyline I want to talk about is that of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, former Lord Protector, and his release. Somerset's rule as Lord Protector had come to an end in October 1549, and he'd been arrested and imprisoned in the Tower. However, he was released on the 6th of February 1550 and pardoned on the 8th of February. After living under house arrest for a few weeks, he was readmitted to the King's Privy Council on the 10th of April. His eldest daughter Anne even married John Dudley's eldest son, John Viscount Lisle, on the 3rd of June. So relations were obviously okay between the two men at this stage. So that storyline is true. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, did indeed take over leading Edward VI's government from Somerset. However, he chose to be styled as Lord President of the Privy Council rather than Lord Protector. It's true that he chose to end the aggression with Scotland, something that was costing the Crown an awful lot of money. And it does appear that he gave the young king more freedom and more say than his predecessor had, choosing to work with the king, to educate him about kingship, rather than ignore the boy. Although Dudley allowed Edward more exercise and had him participating in archery and running at the quintin, which was used as practice for jousting, the king was deemed too young to joust. In this episode, we also saw Dudley burning Mary's religious artefacts, attacking Stephen Gardiner and throwing him down some steps, and hitting his son Robert Dudley. Was the real John Dudley this fiery? Well, Gardiner was safely imprisoned in the Tower, and I've never come across the idea that Dudley burnt Mary's things or that he was seen beating his sons, so that seems to be fiction. Moving on to Mary. Is it true that Spain was trying to help Mary escape? Yes, it is. A fleet of imperial ships did arrive off the coast of Essex in June 1550. As Mary's biographer Linda Porter points out, Mary was very much the moving force of the escape plan, as she believed that both her faith and her life were in danger under the new regime. When Ambassador van der Delft pointed out that if her brother died while she was abroad, it might be hard for her to take the throne, Mary said, "If my brother were to die, I should be far better out of the kingdom, because as soon as he were dead, before the people knew it, they would dispatch me too." Mary moved to Woodham Walter in Essex to prepare to escape. However, she changed her mind at the last minute, just as in the episode, although she was heavily influenced by Robert Rochester, the controller of her household, who didn't agree with her escape plan. It can't have been an easy decision for Mary. In this episode, we also saw Elizabeth being affected by the new regime, as a marriage between her and Prince Frederick of Denmark was negotiated. This is fiction. There was a Prince Frederick, son of King Christian III of Denmark, and he was labelled illiterate, experiencing problems reading and spelling due to severe dyslexia. However, he was never linked to Elizabeth, and no matches were negotiated for Elizabeth at this time. Obviously, in the series, they were using this match to show how rumours had spread about Elizabeth's relationship with Thomas Seymour. I actually thought that this was really overdone. We really didn't need the fictional scene between Lady Jane Grey and Elizabeth, the whore scene, or this fictional letter from Christian of Denmark to tell us that Elizabeth's reputation had been tarnished, that she'd been the subject of gossip, and I'm not sure that Edward VI would have allowed such a letter to be read out like that. Elizabeth was his half-sister. She was royal. It does appear to be true, however, that Mary at one point considered that her half-sister may not have been fathered by Henry VIII, but by court musician Mark Smeaton. I assume that this was because Smeaton confessed to sleeping with Elizabeth's mother Anne Boleyn on 3 occasions, so there was a tiny element of truth in this scene. I had been thinking that it was a shame that this series had missed out Edward VI's friends, showing that human side to the boy, so I was glad to have the gambling scene in this one. In reality, Edward's friends included the Duchess of Suffolk's sons, Charles and Henry Brandon, and Barnaby Fitzpatrick. On to Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. Sadly, there's no basis in fact for the scene between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley, where he professed his love for her and offered to run away with her to save her from marriage to a Danish prince. Of course, the Danish marriage was fiction anyway. The real Elizabeth and Robert Dudley were clearly friends from a young age, For in 1566, Robert said that he knew Her Majesty as well or better than anyone else of her close acquaintances, for they had first become friends before she was 8 years old. Elizabeth called Robert her eyes and sweet Robin, and I do believe he was the love of her life. But that scene was fictional and was, I feel, more about showing the impact that Thomas Seymour had had on her and how that experience had made her grow up than being about her and Robert. When Robert asks her if she loves him, Elizabeth says, "Hello, Thomas." This time she's going to let her head rule over her heart. She realizes her life can't be as simple as choosing love. Finally, we had Edward's illness. I had the subtitles on when I was watching the episode, and the scene in which Elizabeth went to see the king expecting to meet Prince Frederick kept having cough or coughing on the subtitles. It was laid on pretty thick. And then, of course, we had Edward having blood on his handkerchief and collapsing, rather like Satine in Moulin Rouge. The deadly consumption, tuberculosis. I've lost track with the timeline in this series as it really is all over the place. But Edward's health didn't become a problem until April 1552, when he came down with what he described as measles and smallpox at the same time. He recovered relatively quickly, but his biographer Chris Skidmore believes that this bout of illness suppressed his immune system, and so he couldn't fight off tuberculosis, which he came down with in January 1553. Have we suddenly skipped to January 1553? I really don't know. I don't know where we are anymore. The highlight for me of this episode was seeing Elizabeth in the gown and jewellery that she's depicted wearing in the circa 1546 portrait attributed to William Scroats. The jewellery and gown were just stunning, wonderful reproductions. The low point for me was the scene between Lady Jane Grey and Elizabeth. They have a wonderful actress in Bella Ramsey, and the lines and scenes she's been given are dire. We have no idea what Jane thought of what happened in Catherine's household and whether she even knew about it, about what happened between Elizabeth and Seymour. But I can't imagine the real Jane talking to Elizabeth, the king's half-sister, like that and calling her a whore. I didn't feel this scene was at all necessary, and I don't feel that it did anything for either character. I don't know about you. I haven't covered everything, but those were the storylines that stood out for me, and I'd love to know what you thought of the episode, so please do leave your comment. By the way, it's not long now until my online Elizabeth I event, Elizabeth I, The Life of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, which starts in early September. It features 8 historians and will be bringing this iconic queen to life for you, looking at real history. Do join us and join us soon as I'm doing weekly Zoom call discussions, which are so much fun. And also, if you join before the end of August, then you will get an advanced digital copy of my forthcoming book, On This Day in Tudor History too. I'll share a link to find out more and to register in the video description. I'd love you to join us. Take care and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.